Well, it's great to be with you again. I want to start out by just reading another quote from Ministry of Healing. I better situate this paper here better. This is from page 111. It says, "The gospel which he, Christ, taught was a message of spiritual life and of physical restoration. Deliverance from sin and the healing of disease were linked together." That's why it's called gospel, medical, missionary evangelism, because they're linked together. And over on page 20, it says that the Savior made each work of healing an occasion for implanting divine principles in the mind and soul. This was the purpose of his work. He imparted earthly blessings that he might incline the hearts of men to receive the gospel of his grace. And last night Ken mentioned this type of work as true missionary work. And we've just seen the Lord do wonderful things to people as we minister to their needs. And there is a bond that forms. I believe I mentioned a little Catholic lady that we had in our home with the liver cancer and how the liver was swollen, and we had applied fomentations and very large charcoal poultices and the like. And she was very thankful, and my wife would faithfully at night, after she applied the poultice, would kneel by her bed and have prayer with her. And this just brought tears to this lady's eyes. And one night she says, she says, never in my whole life, has anybody ever prayed with me or for me, and especially has nobody ever kneeled down at my bedside and prayed for me. And that really made a bond there that was quite something. I believe that God does answer prayer, and I believe that he does want us to cooperate with him in those efforts. Just a couple of stories on that note, in praying for people and working with people along medical lines. I remember we were invited to a home to have an anointing service for a little boy. And the wife had showed us this little boy's shoulder one day. It was all discolored. And she had taken him to a physician, I believe a GP, and he said that it must have been a bruise. He must have fallen in the bathtub or something like this. Well, she knew that he hadn't, and it had been there for some time, and she wanted us to look at it. Well, upon looking at it, I wasn't sure what it was, but I knew whatever it wasn't something good, and we told her that she should get that diagnosed. And so she did, and it turned out to be scleroderma, which is a disease that where the tissue deteriorates, and it's a process that usually is possibly slow but very progressive in its nature. Muscle and everything actually deteriorates. Well, she asked us to come to her home and have an anointing service for her. And I remember Elder Garner, who is now deceased, and I went over to Whidbey Island and went there and had a service for the little boy. From that point on, that disease stopped in its progression, and to this day has went no further. It stays just like it was. Prior to that time, it was progressively getting worse. So I really believe that the Lord answers prayer. Another time, my stepfather, who was an individual that was never close to God. You couldn't say that he was a man of God by any stretch of the imagination. He had been a logger most of his life, and a drinker and a carouser and an alcoholic, and never gave much thought about God. And I didn't grow up a Christian myself, and so as I grew up in that home, we didn't get along, and I ended up, leaving when I was about 17 and joining the Navy. Well, after I got out of the service, as time went by, I found the Lord, And of course, you know how the Lord brings those thoughts to your minds about things that you may have done to make things worse in a person's life. And I could see that as I was growing up, I'd certainly been no angel. And even though I knew he would never apologize for the terrible things that he had done, I felt that probably I ought to apologize for the things that I had done. And so I wrote him a nice long letter of apology explaining what had happened in my life, and I sent him some books, Desire of Ages, Steps to Christ, Great Controversy. He did like to read, so I thought maybe he might read those books. Well, he rejected them, didn't want anything to do with them. And the years passed, and my mother called me one day and she says, you better come to the hospital because Bert is dying, and you better come and, you know, pay your respects. So I went to the hospital, and he was in very bad shape, had him on all kinds of tubes and things coming out of him, and monitors on him, and he could barely breathe, and could barely converse. And I said to him before I left, I said, you know, they tell me that you're probably not going to walk out of this hospital. And I said, if there's ever a time that you needed the Lord, it's now. And I said, would you mind if I had a prayer with you? And he said, with all the strength he could muster, he says, I don't want anybody praying for me. You know, if you want to pray, you go someplace else and do it, but don't do it in my hearing. I mean, he was a hard man. So I said, okay, that's exactly what I will do. You know, I said, I will go outside your room, and when I get outside your room, I'll have prayer for you there. And so I left the room and went outside, and I had prayer for him outside the room. Well, he recovered, and they didn't think that he was going to. They were sure that he wasn't, but he recovered. And I felt that it was an answer to prayer. Well, several years passed, and I got another phone call, and this time my mother said that Bert is in the hospital, and this time he's dying. And thought he was last time, but for sure he is this time. And you better come and pay your last respects. So I said, okay. So I gathered up my family, and we went to the hospital. I went into the room, and after all the experiences that I had had with this individual, it was very hard for me to talk with him. And I just had small talk, just chit-chat, and knew I should say something, but didn't know what to say. And finally told him goodbye, and I left the room. And went out and told my family, I says, well, let's go. And my wife, she says, what did you say to him? I said, oh, I didn't say anything to him, just small talk. She says, well, don't you think that an individual that carries on the type of work that you carry on, don't you think that you ought to have a little bit more than that to say to somebody that's on their deathbed? I said, well, I suppose, but I don't know what to say, and I couldn't think of anything, and he doesn't want to hear anything anyway, and so let's go. And she says, you really think that your conscience would let you rest if you left this hospital and never spoke to him about his soul's salvation? And I thought, well, okay, all right, I'll consider it. And so I walked down the hall, and I come across this room, and it said for chaplains and pastors. And so I opened the door and walked in, and it was a real quiet little room with a little kneeling, padded kneeling bench there, and had a Bible open, and I was talking to the Lord, and I said, you know, Lord, this man has lived a terrible life, and he doesn't care about you. He doesn't care about eternal things. I've tried to speak to him in times past, but he's not willing to listen. I said, what possibly could I say to this man? I mean, what possibly is there to say to this man? And I couldn't think of anything. So I prayed some more. And I says, well, I have a Bible here, Lord. I said, I don't believe in just thumbing through pages. I says, but if you could lead me to something, I would appreciate it. And I thought to myself, I thought, well, Thessalonians has something to say about the dead and about eternal life. And I says, maybe there's something in Thessalonians. So I turned to Thessalonians. I was just sort of scanning the the chapters, and I was looking at chapter 5 here and sort of reading down and looking for some text, and I came across verse 9 of chapter 5. And verse 9 of chapter 5 says, "For God hath not appointed us to wrath, but to obtain salvation by our Lord Jesus Christ." I said, well, does that mean everybody? Well, yeah, I guess that means everybody, even Bert. You know, that you haven't appointed Bert to wrath, but you've appointed Bert to obtain salvation by our Lord Jesus Christ. I mean, you want old Bert to have salvation as much as you want anybody else to have salvation. So I sort of clung to that the fact that, well, that is the Lord's desire. It's only Bert that's standing in the way. So I went back out and I told my wife all about this. I said, yes, we do need to talk to him about his soul salvation. Let us go right back in there, and we'll have a word with him. And so we went back in there. And she stood on one side and I stood on the other. And I stood there, and she looked at me and I looked at her, and she said, well? And I said, I don't have anything to say. You know, I mean, I just, nothing is coming to me, you know. And I says, you pray for him. And so my wife started talking to him, and she says, Bert, aren't you concerned about your soul? I mean, you're lying here in the hospital. They say that you're probably not going to walk out. You're on your deathbed. Have you made your peace with God? And if not, don't you think it's high time that you did? And he didn't have much to say. And she says, don't you think that it would be a wonderful thing to give your heart to the Lord? Don't you think it'd be a wonderful thing? And she started talking about heaven and all of these things. And he finally said, I don't know how. And she says, well, that's okay. She says, would you be willing? Would you be willing to open up your heart and allow God to actually make you willing to receive salvation? And he says, yes, he thought he might be willing to allow God to make him willing. He thought he'd be that open. And she says, well, then we're going to have a prayer for you. And so she prayed a beautiful prayer for him. And in the middle of that prayer, this hardened individual, I mean, he was hard, he started crying. And he started convulsing with tears. And then when she was done, she says, and now David is going to have a prayer for you. Sort of put me on the spot. But by that time, I was pretty inspired. So I had a prayer for him too. And again, in the middle of the prayer, he started convulsing with tears. And after we were through, we asked him if there's anything that we could do for him. And he said, well, yes. He said, since how you're praying, you could pray that the good Lord could just let me be free from pain for a little while and free from this discomfort that I'm having, and just allow me to get some sleep, because I just haven't slept in a long while. He says, okay, when we leave the room, that's the first thing we'll do when we get to the cars. We'll have a prayer that God will allow that to happen. So the next day, I called back to the hospital and got a hold of my mother, and she told me that after we left, that he fell off into a deep sleep. And he was sleeping so well and so good, and all the vitals were doing so well that they started unhooking all the tubes and things from him and disconnected quite a bit of their paraphernalia. And she says that he is so good this afternoon that they're even talking about him going home and are making plans for that. And I thought, well, that's quite a picture change from deathbed to sitting up in bed and feeling pretty good. So I thought, well, the Lord has answered our prayer. And I had in my mind that what the Lord was going to do here was that he was going to allow old Bert enough time so that we could take him home and share the gospel with him, and so that he could actually really and truly come to the Lord, you know, more than just a deathbed type experience, but give him some time to really hear the word and understand it and look at it. So I felt that's what was going to happen. Well, the day following that, his daughter, who was a step sister to me, came and she started mocking this, because we told my mother to go in and tell him right away that when he gets out of the hospital, we'll come pick him up. You know, we'll rent a hospital bed, we'll put him right in our living room, and we'll care for him, and the like until he's, back on his feet again. When she told him that, he again convulsed with tears, over that. So we knew that the Holy Spirit was really softening this man's heart. So I felt really good about that. But that next day, his daughter came in, and she got wind of what had happened, and she started making fun of it and started belittling it. And he was feeling pretty good at the time, and he just turned from it and says, well, I'll have nobody, stuff religion down my throat, and he started blaspheming God and all that. And that was on a Wednesday, and he was dead on Friday. But even though that was a terrible thing, that he had to die, it certainly told me that the Lord hears prayer. And the Lord answered prayer, and the Lord was going to give him an opportunity, his last opportunity. And had he accepted that last opportunity, I believe that God would have got him out of that hospital and got him to our home where we could have shared the good news with him. So those are things that just sort of stick with you, when you have experiences like that, when the Lord answers prayer for the sick that are in situations that are really impossible. Situations that can't be turned around and are not ever turned around except are turned around with prayer. I think that's a marvelous thing. Well, tonight we're going to get a little more practical. Now you have to understand that this is just sort of barely an introduction, that as far as hydrotherapy and simple remedies and these types of things, we're hardly even scratching the surface. But hopefully it'll be enough that to whet your appetite, that you'll want to, to dig more and to put these things into effect. Every winter, when the flu hits, the telephone at our house just rings off the hook. And it's a wonderful thing. I like the phone ringing for those types of cases. And I can remember one winter, people that were taking antibiotics and doing all sorts of things were not having any success at all. They were relapsing. I mean, there were people back several years ago that were very, very ill from the flu. I mean, some almost on their deathbed. And they would call as a last resort. It's always a last resort. Now, that's the thing I have a hard time understanding, especially when the Lord has told us so much about these wonderful remedies. Why is it always the very last thing that we put our trust in? You see, I don't understand that. But as a last resort, they call and they say, nothing else is working. How is it that you do those things? And we would either come to their house and do it for them, if they were too weak to do it themselves, or we would explain it well enough that they could administer it to themselves. And every time, every single time, without exception to my knowledge, the people responded and got better, just like overnight, not completely well, but on the road to recovery. I mean, it was giving the treatment turned the tide every time. Amen. I can remember, yes, all right, Corla. Yeah, that's right. Another time, I got a phone call. It was in the morning, about 9 o'clock. And it was a lady from Montana who had been to our house because she had terrible headaches, terrible migraine headaches. And we were ministering to her over that issue. And, she had success and she remembered all that. And so she was out visiting her daughter, which lived here in Eatonville, just at the top of the big hill over here in a trailer. And she was very distressed. She says, Dave, do you think you could come and give my daughter a treatment? Her daughter was like, 25, 26 years old with a couple of kids. Husband was a truck driver. And I said, well, why? What's the problem? She says, well, she's got pneumonia. I said, I said, well, how do you know that? She said, well, because the doctor told us. I says, and she says she's in terrible shape. She can hardly breathe. She feels like she's going to die, and on and on. I says, I says, well, what did the doctor say about that? She says, listen, she says, I don't want to talk about the doctor. She says, we just were in the emergency room. We just came from the emergency room. And I said, you mean she was in this kind of shape and she was in an emergency room and they sent her home? And she says, well, you see, we have no money, we have no way of paying. And they weren't that, interested in getting too involved in it, apparently. And so they sent her home. And so I said, okay, well, I'll be over. And I asked her what kind of equipment she had, and I brought some equipment along. And went to the house, and this young girl was in terrible respiratory distress. I mean, terrible distress. She did have a full-blown case of pneumonia, and she was having great troubles breathing. And I was quite concerned for her, and just was quite surprised that they let her come home from the emergency room, because she was definitely a candidate for an emergency room. So I says, well, okay, let's get to work. So we got all the things that we're getting out here tonight, all the towels and fomentation covers and everything, and got the kids, put down for a nap, and pulled out some mattresses and put them right in the middle of the floor, because the only place in the house that was warm, and got them there, and the mother got her all ready, and I showed her how to make up the fomentations, and we applied the treatment. After the first fomentation, just the first fomentation, she just, I mean, she was able to take a deep inspiration of air, and it just, opened up the bronchial tubes and the like, and really made her feel quite relieved. And by the end of the third fomentation, she was feeling much, much better. And after the cold mitten friction, she fell off into a deep sleep. And she hadn't slept in a long time, several days. I went over everything with her mother again, of how to do the treatments and the like, and told her, how much to do. She says, well, should I do another one tonight? I said, yes. In this case, with something this bad, I says, yes, by all means. Give her another one tonight. And I said, then 11 o'clock in the morning, another one, and then at night, another one. I said, do that for 2 more days. And then on Sabbath, just one, and on Sunday, just one. I says, by Monday, she'll be back about her normal duties like it never happened. And that's just exactly the way it was. By Monday, she was back to her normal duties, just like it had really never happened, taking care of her kids and going about those things. And so, for things like pneumonia, especially in its initial stages, and certain respiratory type ailments, fomentations are not just a treatment, they're actually the treatment of choice. There is no better treatment than a good set of fomentations. So, with that introduction, we'll go over here to the table, and we'll talk about this particular treatment. Now I'm going to show you what's called full-body fomentations, a complete treatment. And then after this, we'll sort of kind of back off, and I'll show you what you can do with these things just to a local area. Because we talked about last night how that it's good to do hot and cold contrast, for inflammation, for infection, for that type of thing. But, if it happens to be to your knee, that's just a little more difficult, to get in something. Or if it happens to be on your back, how are you going to get your back into that's more difficult. So there are certain areas that are a little more difficult to get yourself in a bowl, or a little wash tub. So you can give hot and cold with fomentations just as well to local areas as you could by getting your feet in hot water, or part of your body in hot water. While I'm thinking of it, I just want to tell you one more story. Mary may remember this particular incident. In fact, that she may have been in on this episode. Just to show you how marvelous these things are and how marvelous the Lord blesses them. We had a female hydrotherapist at Uchee Pines. Ferguson was her name, right? Pansy Ferguson was her name. And she had a dermatitis on her ankle that was, every now and then acted up and got a little infected. Well, this particular time, she ended up with a full-blown case of cellulitis that it turned into a terrible infection. Her ankle swelled up. Did you see that? Yeah, she was there. And her ankle swelled up, her whole leg swelled up. Pus was just draining out of that thing. It was the type of thing that had you just left it go for a few days, you'd had a gangrene set in. I mean, it was that kind of a thing. Bad. She had a very high fever. This was a life-threatening situation that we had on our hands there at Uchee Pines. Well, the ladies, Heidi Newsley, and you were on it too. You don't think you treated her? I know it was a whole group of girls, because it was round the clock that they were giving her contrasting hot and cold. They were packing her leg in fomentations. They had on charcoal poultices. You know, they were giving ice rubs, you know, and it was round the clock. They did it in shifts, just shifts around the clock. This started like on a Friday, sometime on a Friday. By Monday morning, Dr. Calvin walked into our assembly. We had an assembly on Mondays and on Fridays in the morning. He walked into assembly, and we always had a little time for testimonies. And he stood up, he says, I have a testimony this morning. He says, out of all the cases that have come up to me since I have gotten into this line of work, he says, I have just witnessed the worst. He says, this was a life-threatening ordeal. And he explained how it could have been gangrene, the whole thing. He says, now, had I had her as a patient in my private practice, he said, I would have had her in the hospital. I would have had her connected to an IV, and I would have been pumping into her 3 of the strongest antibiotics known to mankind. And he says, I would have expected that in the matter of maybe 2 weeks, I would have had this thing under control where I would have been comfortable with it. And he said, and to see this thing completely reverse itself in the course of 1 weekend, he said, has increased my faith like nothing else could have ever increased it. He says, I am absolutely and completely sold on natural remedies, and that the Lord will continue to keep His word, that He will add His, well, there's a Spirit of Prophecy statement that says that He will add His supernatural blessings to these remedies as we apply them. So that was a situation where, you know, most people have said, oh, well, it's certainly time to go to the doctor now. I mean, if there's ever a time to take an antibiotic, it certainly is now. And, you know, because we've sort of been living in that environment, most of us. We live in this age of pills and penicillin and antibiotics, and that's kind of where our thoughts go. When the chips really get down, you see, that's kind of where we go. I can remember one morning, my little girl had a temperature that wasn't even on the thermometer anymore. So I don't really know how high it was, but it was all the way to the end. And we had done everything we knew along the natural remedies lines. You know, we had given her cooling enemas. We had given her little fever baths. We had given her some cooling measures. We had done everything that we knew how to do. And finally, at 4 o'clock in the morning, with a raging fever, I got on the telephone, and I called my dear friend Dr. Miller, you know, for some moral support, told him the situation, told him everything that I had done, and he said, you know, he says, this time I don't have one thing to add. He says, there's only one thing that you and I can do. He says, and that is we'll just kneel down here together, and this is over the telephone now. He says, we'll just kneel down here together, and we'll have prayer. And so we knelt down together, and we poured our hearts out to the Lord, and I hung up, and by 8 o'clock in the morning, there was no fever at all when she woke up. Amen. And so many times, you know, the Lord puts you right to the wall. I mean, to the point that He says, well, you know, are you going to trust me, or are you not going to trust me? It would be one thing if you didn't do anything at all, right? But when you work in cooperation with the Lord, you know, in treating the sick, and do everything that you know how to do, and do it as skillful as you know how to do it, and then you turn to the Lord and you ask for His blessing upon it, then you can't believe that He's going to give you a stone, right? That He will give you a blessing. He's promised that. Okay, so let's say that we have an individual, a friend, maybe a neighbor down the street, that is suffering from influenza and has a little bit of respiratory distress, is coughing and congestion and has a fever and is aching all over and just feels right down miserable. they've been told that they have a viral infection, so in this case, you don't even think of antibiotics because antibiotics don't work on viral infections. So if she went to the doctor, he'd say, well, get plenty of rest, drink lots of fluids, and take aspirin. That's about the remedy that they would get. There may be some doctors still that would give her some antibiotics, not for the viral infection that she now had, but for the bacterial infection that she may well get as a secondary infection to this first infection. So you know all this, and so you go to this individual and say, well, why don't you come over to the house here, or I'll come over to your house, and I'll give you a set of fomentations. And so you go over to her house, and you get into the bedroom, and you make a bed on top of the bed. First you put down some plastic. Then on top of the plastic, you put a couple of sheets and a couple of blankets and a pillow. Because, this water, gets things sort of wet. You don't want to ruin the bed. So you do that as a precaution. And also, after you get under the cold mitten friction, you can just roll back the covers. The individual can just slide right into bed. And you can take all this paraphernalia right out of the room, so you just clear the mess up kind of in one great swoop. Also, you want the room to be at about 68 degrees. You don't want it too hot, you don't want it too cold, about 68. You do want some kind of ventilation in the room. You don't want a breeze going right over the individual, but it is good to have some good ventilation, cross ventilation coming through. So you've got the person in bed now. The first thing you want to do is you want to put their feet in a hot foot bath. Now, maybe one of my boys could come up here. Let's see. He's pointing at that one. That one's pointing at that one. Okay, it gives me the impression that they're reluctant. I don't know why I get that impression. How about you, Fernando? You're scared. What's that? Okay, Forrest, here we go.
If you can use an old man.
Oh, sure.
Lay down?
Yes, please.
Okay. I should take
that probably would be, as my math teacher says, more elegant.
These young guys haven't gotten over their inhibitions yet.
Their inhibitions, that's right. And you get our age, you're just too old to care, huh?
That's
right. I'm sure he will be sweating by the time he's down here, because it is warm up here. Okay. Now, rule number one in giving any treatment of hydrotherapy, you always must start with somebody that is already warmed up. If I was to just go right into this treatment and he happened to be cold, half my treatment would be wasted on just warming him up. And then I wouldn't get the effect that I really want. So in order to prevent that, we're going to fill this basin here with nice hot water, and we're going to stick his feet in hot water. Of course, we're just simulating this here.
You wasn't sure.
Okay, let's put him in the water there. All right. So his feet are in nice hot water. We could start out like 104, 106, just depends on the individual. Some people can take water fairly hot, some people can't take it too hot. But we can work on getting it up to about 110 degrees. Also, there's a couple of ways of wrapping a person up in this. The best way to do it is to put your blankets down first and then your sheets on top, and use large sheets so that when you get them in a hot foot bath, you can wrap the sheets over the individual like so, and wrap the blankets over them like so. That way, none of your heat escapes. If you have it the way that I have it right here, then a lot of the steam can come out and get out through the blankets, and you lose a lot of heat. You don't want to lose that heat. Speaking of heat, we talked last night a little bit about water, and the nice thing about water is that we can use it in 3 different forms. We can use it as ice, we can use it as a liquid, we can use it as a steam. Now, it's an interesting thing. Remember we said last night that the specific heat of water was 1, and that it takes 1 calorie to raise the temperature of water 1 degree centigrade for each gram. That's in its liquid state. Now, it's interesting that if we have water, let's say we got a piece of ice here, and let's say this ice is still ice, it's still solid, but it's just starting to melt. And we take the temperature of that ice just before it melts, and we take the temperature of the ice just after it melts, and what temperature is that, do you think? Pardon? 32, or 0 degrees centigrade, okay? 0 degrees centigrade. They're both the same, and yet one is solid and one is liquid. Now, the interesting thing about this is that in order for that ice to melt, it had to take on, per gram, it had to take on 80 calories of heat. 80 calories of heat in order for it to melt. You say, well, you know, big deal. Well, it is a big deal when you put an ice cube, you know, or a big piece of ice, and you're rubbing somebody down with that big piece of ice, and you see that ice melting. You know that the ice is melting because it is extracting from that individual 80 calories per gram of melting water, you see. And so it's pretty cold stuff. That's called a latent heat or a hidden heat. Now, as remarkable as that is, it's even more remarkable when water gets up to the point of boiling, when it reaches 212 degrees Fahrenheit or 100 degrees centigrade. When it converts to steam, it has to take on a tremendous amount of calories per gram of water in order for it to turn to steam. Approximately 537 grams per, or excuse me, 537 calories per gram of water in order to turn to steam. You say, well, okay, what's that do for us? Well, we get this individual under here, and we get all this hot water, and we get steam starting to generate, and as that steam condenses, guess what it does? It liberates 537 calories per gram of water. That's why a Russian steam bath is a tremendous treatment, because you've got steam generating under the chair, and then that steam condenses back into liquid form and liberates just tremendous amount of heat. And that's why we warm these people up. So here we've got Forrest in here. We got his feet in hot water. There's steam in here, and he's starting to get pretty warm. It depends on how cold he was to begin with, but you know, 10, 15 minutes probably at the most is all you'll ever have to keep them in this before you give the treatment. The next thing that we need to find is something to make a fomentation with. Now, you can actually get real elaborate, and you can actually buy fomentation pads. Some people make fomentation pads, or you can make them yourself, you know, out of, maybe you could start with a piece of wool and make sure you washed it real good so that it shrunk down to the size you wanted before you put it in the middle, or else it'll kind of shrink up on you. But the middle piece could be wool, and then you could have 2 layers on each side of that of cotton, because the wool definitely retains a lot of heat, and the cotton, you know, can retain quite a bit of moisture, and it makes a good fomentation. However, I've never went to that elaborate type of a thing. I just use terry cloth towels. The newer the towel, the better, because the thicker it is, the better. Now, if I was to use these towels right here, I'd probably have to use maybe 4 or 5 of them, you know, together to really have it bulky enough to have a good fomentation. But let's say that these were brand new terry cloth towels, nice and thick nap on them. I would take a sprinkler bottle. Another way I like to do this, my wife doesn't like this very well, but sometimes I just take all my towels and soak them in the bathtub, and or else I just throw all of them in the wash machine and put it on the spin cycle, and then of course it gets them wet, you know, and then it spins them out, and that's about how you want them. That's about the you don't want them wet, you want them really damp. So you could do that, or else you could just have a sprinkling bottle and sprinkle water on them until you got them nice and damp, not soppy wet, just damp. And then you take 2 of those towels and you'd put them together. like so. Like that. And then you fold them in half lengthwise, like that. And now you've got 4 layers. But if this was a big, thick nap towel, that would be pretty bulky. And then, seeing as how this is so long, you're just going to use it on the chest, you could also flip it over like that, and now you've got 8 layers. And that makes it even more bulky. The more bulky it is, the more heat that it will retain, and the longer it will last. So you do that to, you take 8 towels, and out of 8 towels you make 4 fomentations. Now the other thing you're going to need is a heat source. This is a canning kettle, as most of you can recognize. And the bigger the canning kettle, the better. You know, this is a relatively small canning kettle for fomentations. It does work, but the bigger, the better. There are other things you can use. You know, microwaves, you can use microwaves. Some people have even used convection ovens, things like that. However, the best is still the old steam kettle. It just works better than anything that I know of. Sometimes your microwave, you know, it'll be all steamy on parts of it, and parts it'll be cold, and you know, it's not real consistent sometimes in the way it heats things up. But a good canning kettle does it quite nicely. You just take the platform out and turn it upside down and return it, and then you just put a couple inches of water. You don't want your water over the top of this platform. This can be a platform to lay your fomentations on. So you just want a couple inches of water in here, because all you want to do is create some steam. And you take your fomentations that you've made here and put them in. This is fine for demonstration. And we'll put them on the stove back here and turn it on high. And when this thing starts boiling, then you time it for 15 minutes. After it starts boiling, time for 15 minutes. After 15 minutes, you'll know that you've got a good, steaming, hot fomentation that's really going to work for you. People often ask, well, can I just use a hot water bottle, or can I just use this, or can I just use that? Well, you know, as we've understood a little bit about the physical properties of water and talking about steam and all these things, we see that no, those things don't work very well because they don't communicate much heat. Even though they're at the same temperature that the water's at, yeah, we can see that they still do not hold the same amount of calories of heat as water does. So water is going to communicate a far greater amount of heat, and is going to absorb a far greater amount of heat than just about any other substance. And it's going to do it in a very reasonable fashion. Okay, so we've got our fomentations cooking up, and we've got him here, and he's warming up. The other thing we're going to need is fomentation covers. Now, the way you make a fomentation cover is just take an old blanket that you have no use for anymore, a single bed blanket, and you just cut it in quarters, and then you have a fomentation cover. It's no harder than that. And they need to be about that big, about 36 by 36 or thereabouts. You lay 4 of those out on the table, like so. And then when you're ready for your fomentations, you just lay your fomentations in the cover, wrap it up, and then it's ready to put on the individual. However, these things are very hot even though they're in the covers. And so what you're going to have to do is have some more towels standing by to put down over the fomentation, maybe 2 towels, maybe 3 towels. Just depends. I mean, depends on the individual, just depends on how hot that fomentation is, on how many towels. The way you know is you keep asking the person. You know, he lays down on it, and you say, now, how is that? Well, that's fine. And a little bit later, how is that? That's fine. And I don't know how it is with ladies, because I don't do this to ladies, but I know with men, you know, we've got to be very, very macho. And so with men, there's a little trick on knowing whether it's hot or not. You just watch for that little tear trickling down the side of their cheek. And when you see that, you know that you know, you need to put on some more towels. Because they always say no, you know. No, yeah, no, it's fine. It's fine. Okay. So we'll get back here now. We're going to put a fomentation on. You need something on your hand, because this will burn your hand. So I like those big kitchen mittens, those big bulky mittens. And when you take this off, remember to take it off like this, not like that, because you'll burn your arm real good if you do it that way. So you got this heavy mitten on. You take your towel, you lay it out here on your fomentation cover, and because it's big and I don't need it quite that long, I'll double it up, flip it this way, and bring it over here to Forrest. And I'll help him sit up here. And I'm going to lay this pad down so it covers from about the small of his back up to just about in here. Okay, now don't lay down on that yet. We've got to put a cover on it. So we can double up a towel or maybe 2 towels, depends. And we cover that up like so. And he can lay down. Now, once you put this particular fomentation down, you never have to change it because it's sandwiched in between him and the bed, and it stays piping hot pretty much the whole time through. The only changes that we'll be doing is on the chest, and we'll do 3 changes to the chest. So we come over here, get our kitchen mitten again, back over here, roll out another fomentation. Come over to his chest. And you want to pretty well cover the whole chest, you know, from the rib cage all the way up. If you happen to have a sore throat, you could even bring it up to the throat. And then you can cover that with another towel to even insulate a little bit more, and then cover him up. You nice and warm?
Yes.
Then you want a nice cold compress wrung out of ice water on his head. Just think cool.
Beginning to feel like Texas.
So now at this time we have a fomentation on the back, we have his feet in hot water, have a fomentation on the chest, and we have a cool compress to his head. Now when I am working with individuals and I have them in this position, especially non-Adventists, this is the time that I usually ask them if they'd mind if I had a prayer for them. Because, well, they're in a situation, as you can see, that they're not too likely to say no, not really in that good a position to say no. And I've never had one yet, you know, deny me of that opportunity. So I usually have a prayer for him at that particular time. So what's actually happening here? Because he had a chest congestion, we wanted, and probably congestion in his head too, we wanted to decongest the head and we wanted to decongest the chest. So we have the feet in hot water. Remember last night we said that having feet in hot water is going to help decongest because it's going to pull a lot of blood down to the feet, and it's going to break up the congestion in those areas that where the viruses are really working, and things do tend to congest there. So we've got that going for him. We've got a fomentation on the back and a fomentation on the chest because we want to really get the circulation moving through that area a lot. And it does so for a number of different reasons. And I don't want to elaborate on this too much because it's a little bit too detailed. But there are several laws that hydrotherapy works under. One law has to do with reactive homeostasis. In other words, we talked that first night about how the body works on the principle of homeostasis, likes to keep everything the same. And so when you put something hot on the body, guess what it tries to do? It tries to disperse that heat. It reacts. It dilates the blood vessels, and it reacts and tries to bring blood there to get the heat away and disperse it throughout the body because it's hot. So that's a reaction that takes place. Another thing we have is we talked about Van Hoff's principle. And Van Hoff's principle has to do with heating up the tissues. And we know as the tissues heat up that the chemical reactions that take place inside those tissues also are sped up. And white blood cell activity, for example, the white blood cells are more active in the heat than they are in the cold. and they're able to do a better job and more of a job when there's heat. There's also some destruction of bacteria and other things as the heat gets turned on. Things like the spirochete, which is the organism in syphilis. It's destroyed at about 102 degrees. And the way they used to treat syphilis in the old days before penicillin was they used to give the patient a good dose of malaria. And the malaria, see, they knew how to cure malaria, and so they would give them a good dose of malaria, and that would make a raging fever, and that would kill the spirochete, and then they would treat the malaria. That's one way of doing it, but actually this is much better way of treating even that. Okay, so that's what's happening with the forest here. You know, the hydrostatically, the pipes are bigger down here in the feet now, and it's going down there to fill that up. It's decongesting his head. Blood is surging here to try to disperse this heat. And also another mechanism that is working for us here is a reflexive mechanism. When you put the fomentation on the chest and it dilates the blood vessels in the skin, reflexively via the nervous system, it also dilates the blood vessels in the deeper tissues. So what you see happening on the surface is exactly the same thing that's happening down deeper in the tissues. And then we're going to apply a nice cold rub on top of this, and we're going to get an initial constriction or blanching, but then the body is going to come back because it's just a small area. We only did it for a brief time. The body is going to come back, and there's almost a pumping effect for a little while. Some people like to look at it as kind of a wringing out of the tissues a bit. I can remember an old fellow who I was giving some fever therapy treatments to at Uchee Pines. I'd give him a nice hot fever therapy treatment. He always wanted me to take the hose, and the first thing he wanted me to do was put it on his liver, you know. And he says, I just picture it being wrung out like a sponge, he says. Oh boy, time is going quickly here. Okay, so after this first fomentation, and this first one lasts 3 minutes, you have it on there 3 minutes, we remove it, and we take another washcloth, and we do a cold mitten friction rub. And as you do that, you'll see kind of a blanching of the skin, but by the time you're done, the blood is just really circulating in there, and the skin is very red. And you know that the same thing is happening down deep in the tissues. And white blood cells are going there, more oxygen is being taken there, more nutrients are being taken there, and waste products are being taken away. You know, all the good things you want to be happening are happening. Okay, now because of shortness of time, we'll say that we applied the other two fomentations exactly the same way that we applied this. And, and then to wrap this treatment up, we're going to do the cold mitten friction on the chest, and then to wrap it up, we're going to do a cold mitten friction on his entire body, one part at a time. So we take and get our compresses wet, and we start with one arm, and he's sweating, and we just rub real vigorously, real vigorously up and down, and then we dry that with another towel, dry it off. Stick it back under the covers, and then we do the same thing with the other arm. Then we come down to the feet, and I never think about this until after I get here, but if you're thinking about it, it's nice to have a towel sitting under this tub, so that after you've poured the cold water and you remove the tub, his feet come right down on a towel, and you can dry them off. That way it doesn't get the sheets really soppy wet. So we lift them up like this, and we take this ice cold water, and we have them lift their feet up just a bit, and then we pour the water over the feet. And they always go, nice gasp of air. Then we take that away, their feet come down on a towel, and we dry the feet off. The next thing we do is we get our mittens again, and we get them wet, and we do one leg, We usually like to go up on the sides like this and come back on the top and the bottom. You know, up on the sides, back on the top and the bottom. Dry it off, and then do the same to the other leg. The last thing we do is lift you up here, is do a cold mitten friction to the back. And then dry that all off. Remove all the paraphernalia. Take the covers back. Let them slide right into a nice fresh bed. And just take all this out of the room. And then we have them rest for at least 1 hour. At least 1 hour. That's full fomentations. And as I said, I showed you the whole thing, but you have to realize that you can use those fomentations just one over a local area, like to a knee or to a thigh or to a back or to a shoulder, you know, something you can't get into a bowl or a basin, works just as well. These are tremendous things. If you've ever had, you know, real bad pain someplace, like say you're passing a kidney stone. I thought when a brother said about passing kidneys, very painful, isn't it? Yes. Just about nothing like it in the world. Just your kind of knees kind of turn to butter, and you just feel pretty squeamish. But a fomentation, a good hot fomentation right over that kidney would have probably taken that pain, just melted it away in just a matter of moments. Now, because you're still passing, it might have continued a little bit, but boy, this would have really made it feel like it was something you could probably handle a bit better. Okay, I guess we'll go off the camera, and then I was going to say a few more things, but I know we're close to running out of time here, so I guess we'll quit right there. Is that right?